Here's Mr. Tucket, chapter 6 and 7. Francis awakened to a heavenly smell, the aroma of boiling coffee. He was afraid that if he opened his eyes, the smell of coffee would vanish. But when a full 10 seconds had passed and the smell was still there, he knew he hadn't been dreaming. He sat up and saw the mountain man sitting over a small fire about 10 feet away. His back was to Francis, but he spoke at once without turning around. "About time you opened up a mite. Day's half gone already. You sleep like a fancy city man." Francis stretched, wincing at the pain in his legs. That would be from the little mare, and the pain in his arms would be from falling on them, and the pain in his knees from the rocks he had landed on. But the pain in his stomach was from hunger. How'd you know I was awake?" he asked after a moment. "Your breathing changed. When you quit sucking wind like an old buffalo, I figured you were coming around." "You've sure got good ears." "I'm alive. You don't stay that way long out here unless you can hear a little." Francis filed away that advice and got up. Everything in him hurt with the movement. He didn't believe anything could be that stiff and still be alive. "I thought you said you could ride," the mountain man chuckled. "I did all right," Francis answered defensively. "If you mean you made it alive, I guess you did at that. But I wouldn't call what happened to your hands and knees all right. Seems to me you lost a little hide. Still, you pulled a good trick with that mare, sending her off ahead while you came upstream." His chuckle turned to an outright laugh. "I followed Braid and 5 or 6 others for a while when they came after you. Unless I miss my guess, they're down on the Powder River somewhere still after that mare." "I didn't plan it," Francis cut in. "I fell off." "Eh?" "I said I fell off her when she hit the stream. I fell off and she kept right on going without me." "That's sort of what I figured. But I thought it would be better if you said it. Kind of keep the air clean around here if we talk straight." He turned to face Francis for the first time. "You know, that lie about knowing how to ride could have got us both killed last night, don't you? They could have caught you and worked you over a bit, and the first thing you know, you would have been telling them all about my getting a horse for you. Don't go shaking your head. I know you wouldn't want to talk, but I've seen the Pawnees make a man tell stories he didn't even know. So from now on, you just tell me what you know is straight, and that'll keep us both out of trouble. What's your name?" "Francis Alphonse Tucket." "I said it would be better if we kept everything straight, boy. Now, what's your handle?" "I wasn't lying. My name really is Francis Alphonse Tucket. Honest." "Let me put it another way. What do you go by? I mean, haven't you got a sort of short name they call you?" Francis thought a minute, then shook his head. "My mother always called me Alphonse, and my father called me Francis. I guess you could take your pick." The trapper shook his head. "I'm sorry, and nothing against your folks, understand, but I don't like either of them. They don't hit my tongue right. Tell you what, my name is Jason Grimes. You call me Mr. Grimes, and I'll call you Mr. Tucket. That should keep us both happy. Is that all right with you?" Francis shrugged. "Suits me fine, Mr. Grimes." "Good. Now then, Mr. Tucket, why don't you hobble your crippled body over here and have a sip of coffee? There's nothing like a touch of coffee to take the sharp edge off an empty belly. After that, I'll give you a little venison jerky. And while you're chewing that, you can tell me how you came to be the son of that old Pawnee lady." Francis had tried coffee before, stolen from his mother's stove with sugar in it, and he took some in a gulp. It was bitter, and he nearly spit it out, but the heat of it felt good and seemed to take away some of the ache in his stomach. The jerky was as tough as an old boot. While he chewed it, and it took some chewing, he told Mr. Grimes about the adventure, starting with the wagon train and the rifle. He finished his tale by telling how Braid had thrown the doll down in front of him. Mr. Grimes nodded when Francis finished. "That Braid is a mean one. Back before I made friends with the Pawnees by bringing them powder and lead every time I came through, Braid and I had one bush ripper of a fight. Knives, hatchets, the whole works. I guess it lasted over an hour, and when it was done, he had one scar down his back, and I had lost an arm." "You mean Braid took your arm off?" Francis asked. No, he just cut it good. But it got infected later, and I had a doctor in St. Louis whack it off before it poisoned my whole body. It makes for some pretty tight talking whenever I come into his village. Braid hasn't forgotten his scar a bit, and every time I come in, he asks me to wrestle. Oh, and speaking of wrestling, I've got something for you. Won it from Braid yesterday, wrestling. He made the mistake of tying one arm behind his back to make the fight more fair. He was too stupid to realize that I've got all kinds of practice with only one arm, so I whipped him pretty easy. As he talked, Mr. Grimes went to his saddle and pulled out a blanket wrapped around something. He carefully unrolled the blanket and handed Francis his rifle, mold, powder, and caps. My rifle! Yep, and a sweet little shooter she is, too. I knew it was yours when you started telling me about getting it for your birthday. Seeing as how it looks like we'll be riding together for a while, at least until I teach you enough so you can make Oregon on your own. We'll take a couple of days off, and I'll teach you to shoot it. I can shoot, Francis said. Well, maybe you can, and maybe you can't. But just reading signs makes your story look thin. What do you mean? Francis asked. I mean, if you really knew how to shoot that rifle, it wouldn't have been 7 Pawnees jumping you that day by the wagon train. It would only have been 5, and maybe just 4, and those 4 would have been thinking seriously about going home without you. That's what I mean. No, Mr. Tucket, that isn't quite the way it's done. It was the first time Mr. Grimes used the long, drawn-out negative answer to something Francis had messed up. But it wasn't to be the last. In fact, he would use that long no, as Francis thought of it, about 10 times to every short nod, which was the way the mountain man approved of anything. It was the afternoon of the day Francis and Mr. Grimes had met at the stream. Francis had just loaded and fired his rifle as instructed by Mr. Tuck Grimes. He felt that he'd done all right. A piece of wood more than 30 yards distant had turned to splinters with his shot, and it had been the piece of wood he was shooting at. What did I do wrong? He asked. I hit the piece of wood, didn't I? There was just a thin bit of annoyance in his voice. Mr. Grimes smiled and hooked his right hand in the back of his neck, stretched. Well, now that's just about what everybody says when they don't know about rifles. He mimicked Francis. I hit the piece of wood, didn't I? And yes, you did, Mr. Tucket. You hit the piece of wood. But how many times more can you hit it? Go ahead. Load up and hear it and have at it. Pick another piece of wood out there and hit it for me, will you? Francis loaded and aimed and fired at a buffalo chip about 40 yards away. He missed. He tried twice more and missed both times. Mr. Grimes nodded. It's this way. You're holding that thing like it was an old rag. Your arms are loose. You're slopping your cheeks against the stock. You're grabbing with your hands, and that's all wrong. You'll hit once or twice that way if you're lucky, but the real trick of shooting a decent gun is to be able to put about 4 out of 5 balls in the same place, or nearly so. Now, Mr. Tucket, you'll see. We'll see if we can't do a little reshaping of that crippled body of yours. He wasn't fooling. In the next 5 minutes, Francis felt as though both his arms had been broken. Mr. Grimes pulled Francis's right elbow up so high the shoulder popped, and he jerked the left elbow down directly beneath the barrel of the rifle. Don't grab with that left hand on the stock. Just make a baby cradle with your fingers and let the rifle sleep in it. Francis nodded. It hurt standing that way, but he could see how it made for more consistent shooting. All right, Mr. Tucker, load up and fire again. Francis didn't start hitting right away, but at least his shots were falling in the same general area. He turned after 4 shots. How's that? Mr. Grimes nodded. All right, but you're taking too long to reload. What do you mean too long? It was just a couple of seconds between shots. Actually, it was more like a minute. But that wasn't what Mr. Grimes meant. It's this way, Mr. Tucket. What would you do if Braid came riding up that creek right now? Why, Francis blushed. He was standing with his rifle, an empty rifle. If Braid or any other threat, for that matter, came riding up the creek, Francis knew it would take him at least 30 seconds to load. That's right, Mr. Tucket. You'd be tied like a cow before you got powder down that bore. Every time you shoot, no matter whether you're shooting at buffalo chips or buffalo, you load as soon as a ball leaves the barrel. Carrying an empty rifle is about like carrying an empty water skin. When you get really thirsty, Mr. Tucket, you can't drink air. Francis smiled sheepishly. I guess I've got a lot to learn, haven't I? Yep, Mr. Tucket, you have a lot to learn, but you're coming along. Now let's clean that little shooter of yours and try some rapid firing. That's what really separates the men, or boys for that matter, from their scalps in this country, not being able to shoot fast. Cleaning the rifle was easy. Francis just cupped creek water in his hand and poured it down the barrel, swabbed it with a piece of patch on the end of his ramrod, then greased the bore. Now this is how we'll do it, Mr. Grimes. Mr. Grimes told him, fetching his own rifle from the saddle. We'll have a sort of contest. We'll start at the same time, and the one who gets the most shots off while I count to 10 will get out of working tonight, getting wood and cooking some of the jerky. Does that suit you, Mr. Tucket? Francis nodded. He didn't see how he could lose shooting against a one-armed man. All right, Mr. Tucket, go. But you don't even have your rifle out of its case, Mr. Grimes, Francis said. You aren't even ready. Just giving you the benefit of a little head start, Mr. Tucket. Ready? Go! They both fired at the same instant. Mr. Grimes had just flipped his rifle and fired one-armed before its buckskin case hit the ground. One, he said, starting the count. Francis worked frantically from his flask. He poured powder into his cup palm. Then he emptied the roughly measured powder down the bore. Two! As Francis was placing the patch across the path of the bore, the mouth of the bore, he heard the roar of Mr. Grimes Hawkins. He couldn't believe it. He put the ball on the patch and drew the ramrod from its cradle beneath the barrel. He started the ball down with his thumb. Three! And put the ramrod on top of it. As he slammed the ball home, he heard the mighty Hawkins roar again. Mr. Grimes had fired 3 to Francis's 1. Francis cupped the nipple, raised the rifle, 4, and fired. As the second shot tore a buffalo chip to pieces, the Hawkins belched fire a 4th time. It was too much for Francis. He lowered his rifle and watched Mr. Grimes. 5! Mr. Grimes raised his Hawkins and fired. Number 5. 5 shots in the time it had taken Francis to make 2. Clearly, Francis had missed something. 6! Mr. Grimes lowered the Hawkins and held it between his knees. In one fluid motion, he poured powder from the flask to at his side down the barrel directly without measuring, and brought the muzzle of the rifle up to his mouth. From his lips, he spit a ball into the muzzle without a patch. It slid freely down, needing no ramrod. He slammed the butt of the rifle into the ground to seat the ball, and from the space between his fingers pulled a percussion cap. It fitted quickly on the nipple. The Hawkins came up, and 7! Smoke again poured out over the grass. Mr. Grimes lowered his rifle and grinned. I don't guess I have to go all the way to 10 after all. But that wasn't fair, Francis said. You didn't patch your balls or measure your powder. Now, Mr. Tucket, the word fair is pretty loose. What's not fair in St. Louis at a turkey shoot might be fair when you're about up against 5 or 6 Comanche. He cut the word Comanche off. Out here, people sort of think of fair meaning same as alive. Savvy? Francis smiled. Savvy. Fair means that I'm going to gather wood and cook jerky. You are coming along, Mr. Tucket, the mountain man said, grinning again. 10, 15 years, if you're still alive, you'll be the best wood gatherer in the Black Hills. That was Mr. Tucket. That was chapter 6 and 7. That was fun. All right. Be back later tomorrow. Bye.